A millionaire saw a beggar woman crying with a baby in her arms on the road and took them home. The next day he turned pale when he saw his wife hugging the baby, whispering the same name as his deceased son. The maternity ward was immersed in an atmosphere of anticipation and anxiety. Vivian, lying in the hospital bed with her hair still damp from sweat after the difficult delivery, felt her heart racing as she waited to see her son for the first time. The white walls and the characteristic hospital smell seemed to suffocate her, especially since Benjamin, her husband, was traveling and couldn't be present at this special moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gown, and her thoughts wandered between the joy of being a mother and an inexplicable premonition that had tormented her since the beginning of her pregnancy. My God, why doesn't this tightness in my chest go away? I should be happy, just happy. But something inside me screams that something is wrong, she whispered to herself. The nurse entered the room carrying a small blue bundle, her face emanating that characteristic joy of someone who participates daily in the miracle of life. The baby was very quiet, freshly cleaned and warmed, ready for his first encounter with his mother. Vivian reached out eagerly, her eyes welling with tears of emotion. As the nurse approached, she began to speak in that sweet, professional voice. "Mom, here is your prince, a strong and healthy boy. He's perfect," said the nurse. Vivian's world seemed to spin in slow motion as she received her son in her arms. The little one moved gently, and it was at that moment that the sleeve of the romper suit slid up slightly, revealing a small birthmark. The air escaped from Vivian's lungs as if she had been punched in the stomach. That mark. The same mark. Her face instantly turned pale, and her hands began to tremble more violently. "No, it can't be up. This is impossible," she thought, as her world silently crumbled. The nurse, perceiving the sudden change in the new mother's behavior, approached with concern. The heart monitor next to the bed began to register faster beats, and Vivian's face was growing paler. Adjusting the baby in the mother's trembling arms, the nurse asked in a soft but worried voice, "Mrs. Vivian, is everything okay? Are you feeling unwell? Do you want me to call the doctor?" she asked, looking worried. Panic was growing inside Vivian like a giant wave about to break. Her hands clutched the baby tighter, while her mind worked frantically trying to process what that mark meant, the consequences that would come, the life she had built crumbling before her eyes. With a trembling voice and barely able to form the words, she finally managed to say, "Please, I need to be alone with my son for a few minutes. Just a few minutes. I need to have this moment with just us." The nurse hesitated for a moment, her professional instinct alerting her that something wasn't right. The new mother's behavior was atypical, different from the natural joy she usually witnessed in these moments. However, years of experience had also taught her that some mothers needed that moment of intimacy to process the new reality. With a gentle smile, she adjusted the pillows behind Vivian and walked towards the door, saying in a reassuring voice, "Of course, I'll leave you two alone for a few minutes, but if you need anything, just press the call button. I'll be right there at the nurse's station." As soon as the door closed, Vivian allowed the tears she had been holding back to flow freely down her face. Looking at the little being in her arms, so innocent and oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions his mere existence was causing, she began to speak between sobs. "My God, it can't be. No. What's happening? What have I done?" The baby stirred in her arms, slightly opening his little eyes and letting out a small sigh. That innocent movement only served to increase Vivian's anguish. Her heart was divided between the maternal love that was beginning to blossom and absolute terror. In her mind, a desperate plan was forming, a terrible solution that made her heart tighten even more. "Forgive me, my angel. Forgive me for what I'm going to do, but it's the only way," she whispered in a choked voice, gently kissing the baby's forehead. Minutes later, the corridor of the private wing was silent when Vivian peeked out from the slightly open door of her room. The night shift had just begun, and the change of shifts created those precious minutes of distraction for the medical staff. With trembling legs from the recent delivery, she held the small bundle close to her chest and slipped silently out of the room, her steps muffled by the softness of the slippers that replaced her elegant heels. "Don't cry now, please," Vivian whispered, tensing every muscle of her aching body not to make a sound as she slipped through the corridors. Her watchful eyes checked every movement in the staff rooms. The path to the service elevator seemed endless. Vivian had to stop several times, leaning against the cold hospital walls to catch her breath. The pain from the recent delivery throbbed in her body, but she continued. With every distant sound of footsteps, her heart raced. A nurse passed down the adjacent corridor pushing a medication cart, and Vivian quickly hid behind a column, holding her breath. "Doctor, have you seen the patient in room 304? I need to check her and the baby's vital signs." The nurse's voice from the shift echoed distantly, causing Vivian to quicken her steps towards the emergency exit leading to the parking lot. The parking lot was partially empty at that hour of the night, with only a few cars from the staff on duty scattered around the covered area. Vivian stumbled between the vehicles, looking for an isolated spot where no one usually walked. Her legs were trembling more and more, the pain of childbirth mixed with the physical and emotional effort, making each step an agony. The baby started to move in her arms, and she could feel the small body seeking warmth and comfort. Tears blurred her vision as she repeatedly whispered, "I'm sorry, my love, I'm sorry, but I can't let them destroy our family. I can't allow for everyone to find out. It's better this way. It has to be this way." In the farthest area of the parking lot, behind a row of bushes that separated the hospital from the neighboring property, Vivian found a small space between two old vans that seemed abandoned. The concrete ground was cold and damp, and the wind blowing between the buildings carried a storm warning. With almost maternal care, even in her despair, she adjusted the small bundle on the ground, making sure the baby was well bundled up. Her hands trembled violently as she arranged the little blue cap on her son's head one last time. "Someone will find you soon, my little angel. They have to find you. God wouldn't allow any harm to come to an innocent," she murmured between desperate sobs. The path back to the room was even more torturous. Each step seemed to tear a piece of her soul away, and the weight of guilt was already beginning to crush her chest. The hallways now seemed endless, and the distant voices of the medical staff sounded like accusations in her ears. When she finally reached her room, Vivian could barely make it to the bed before her legs gave out. It was then that the reality of what she had done hit her with full force, and a muffled scream escaped her throat. "My son! My baby! What have I done? My God, what have I done?" The noise alerted the nurse on duty, who came running into the room. She found Vivian in hysterics, clutching the bedsheets, her face contorted in a mask of despair that seemed too genuine. With a voice broken by sobs, she began to scream, "My baby, he stopped breathing. I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't respond. Please, do something." The nurse immediately activated the emergency code, and within seconds, the room was filled with healthcare professionals. The medical team mobilized quickly, questioning Vivian about what had happened. She maintained her story between tears and sobs. "He was in my arm, so still. I thought he was sleeping, but when I looked, her voice failed, and the attending physician immediately ordered a complete search of the hospital. "Call security. Check all the cameras. We need to find this baby immediately." His commanding voice echoed down the hallway. Chaos ensued at the hospital. Security teams rushed through the corridors. Doctors and nurses scoured every corner of the building. Vivian remained in her bed, apparently in a state of shock, but her mind was in complete turmoil. "They can't find him. They can't know what I did. Benjamin would never forgive me," she thought as she watched the frantic activity through the door of her room. Outside, the sky began to darken rapidly, heavy clouds gathering over the city. The temperature dropped drastically, and the first raindrops began to fall, hitting the hospital windows like little accusations. Vivian felt her heart tighten even more. The rain was now pouring heavily, and through the window she could see the parking lot being lashed by the storm. The thought of her tiny son alone in that cold darkness made her body shiver involuntarily. "Mrs. Vivian," the nurse called, noticing her agitation. "I need you to try to calm down. Your blood pressure is very high, and that won't help anyone right now." The following hours were a blur of activity and tension. Police arrived at the hospital, beginning a preliminary investigation. Vivian repeated her story several times, each repetition seeming to drive the lie deeper into her heart. Between one question and another from the investigators, her thoughts wandered to the parking lot, to that little bundle left between the vans. Has someone found him yet? Is he sheltered from the rain? And what if no one finds him in time? These thoughts tortured her, but she maintained her mask of a mother in despair over the sudden loss of her child. Night wore on, and the storm only worsened. The thunderclaps now echoed through the hospital corridors like accusatory screams, and every lightning flash illuminated Vivian's pale, tormented face. One of the nurses brought a sedative, insisting that she needed to rest. "I can't sleep. How can I sleep without knowing where my son is?" she protested, but her voice no longer carried the same conviction as earlier in the night. As the sedative began to take effect, Vivian struggled against sleep, her last conscious thought a desperate prayer. May someone find him. May someone save him. And may God one day forgive me for what I did today. The rain continued to fall relentlessly outside, washing away the evidence of her crime but not her conscience. The night wore on mercilessly as Natalie dragged herself through the last few blocks toward the hospital. Her body burned with fever, and each step was a battle against the dizziness that threatened to bring her down. Her tattered and dirty clothes betrayed her condition as a homeless person, and she could feel the judging looks of people hurrying past, diverting their paths to avoid getting too close. "Please, God, just a few more steps. I don't care about the looks, I just need help," she murmured to herself, clinging to consciousness with all the strength she had left. The emergency department was bustling when she finally managed to push through the heavy glass doors. Immediately, a well-dressed lady pulled her purse closer to her body and stepped back, as if misery were contagious. The air conditioning hit her damp body like thousands of icy needles, intensifying her shivers. Stumbling to the reception desk, Natalie had to lean against the cold surface to keep from falling. The receptionist immediately wrinkled her nose, looking disdainfully at her wet clothes that left small puddles on the clean floor. "This is not a shelter, ma'am. This is a private hospital," she said curtly, even before Natalie could open her mouth. With a trembling, fever-hoarse voice, Natalie tried to explain her situation. "Please, I'm very sick. I've lost everything. I have nowhere to go. I just need a doctor. I have a fever. I can't make it anymore." She began to explain, but before she could continue, the receptionist cut her off with an irritated gesture. "I told you this is not a place for beggars. We have a different clientele. The community hospital is a few hours from here." Her words were as sharp as razors, cutting the last thread of hope Natalie clung to. An elegant couple passed by her, casting disapproving glances as they whispered to each other. The woman discreetly sprayed perfume on her handkerchief, covering her nose as if the mere act of breathing the same air as Natalie could contaminate her. How can they be so cruel? I'm a human being like them. I just didn't have the same opportunities, thought Natalie, feeling tears burn her already feverish eyes. Despair grew in her chest like a suffocating wave. Her legs trembled so much she could barely stand. A security guard was already approaching with determined steps, his expression making clear his intention to remove her from there. "Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to leave." "You're scaring our patients," he said, positioning himself intimidatingly by her side. "Please, I can't even walk. How will I get to another hospital?" Natalie pleaded, her voice fading amid sobs. Dragging herself out of the hospital, practically expelled by the security guard, Natalie managed to reach the covered sidewalk. The cold concrete beneath her body offered momentary relief from the heat consuming her from within. A group of doctors passed by her, chatting animatedly about their shifts, without even looking at the fallen figure on the ground. Is this how it ends? Dying on the sidewalk of a hospital while people pretend I don't exist? She thought bitterly, allowing her tears to flow freely. The storm intensified and Natalie watched through her fever-blurred eyes as people entered and left the hospital. She saw an entire family running to escape the rain, the mother carefully shielding her son with an expensive umbrella, while she herself huddled closer against the wall, trying to find some protection. Time dragged cruelly, and her consciousness began to dangerously waver. Flashes of her life before the fire crossed her feverish mind, the small room she rented, her job as a maid, her dreams of a better life. Everything had turned to ashes in a matter of minutes, just as her dignity now seemed to be disintegrating as she shivered on the cold sidewalk. Before I was invisible on the city streets. Now I'm invisible even as I'm dying, she thought, feeling the fever rise even higher. Another group of people rushed into the hospital, shaking off their umbrellas and complaining about the rain that had dampened their expensive shoes. The security guard who had expelled her kept shooting threatening glances her way, ensuring she wouldn't try to enter again. Natalie could hear fragments of conversations about a missing baby, nurses and doctors rushing by. But everything seemed distant, as if she were observing through a fogged glass. How ironic. They searched so hard for a child in there, while leaving an adult to die out here. She mumbled to herself, tasting the bitterness mingling with the rain on her lips. The icy wind cut her skin like tiny blades, and her thoughts were becoming increasingly confused. She remembered her mother, who always said God never gave a burden greater than we could bear. But now, shivering with fever and cold on the sidewalk of a hospital that refused to treat her, Natalie began to doubt those words. Has God also forgotten the poor? Does he only look at those with money? She questioned in a sob-broken whisper. It was then that, amidst the sounds of the storm and the constant bustle of the emergency room, a different sound reached her ears. Initially, she thought it was just another fever-induced hallucination, but the sound repeated itself. A faint cry, almost imperceptible, coming from the darker area of the parking lot. Natalie forced her eyes to focus in the direction of the sound, her heart racing with sudden understanding. This is not delirium. Someone is crying out there. A baby, she thought, feeling an inexplicable strength begin to take over her weakened body. With a pounding heart and wobbly legs, Natalie dragged herself toward the crying. The rain showed no mercy, and the darkness of the parking lot was cut only by occasional flashes of lightning, illuminating her tortuous path between the cars. The sound of crying grew clearer with each stumbling step she took, guiding her like a beacon in the storm. When she finally reached the spot, hidden between two old vans, her heart nearly stopped. There on the cold, wet concrete was a small blue bundle. Who could be capable of abandoning a child on a night like this? God forgive me, but there are people who don't deserve to be called mothers, she murmured, as her feverish, trembling hands reached for the small bundle. The baby was ice-cold to the touch, his skin taking on a purplish hue that made Natalie momentarily forget her own condition. With trembling fingers, she examined the tiny being. It was a newborn, still with remnants of the umbilical cord, wearing only a thin onesie that offered no protection against the biting cold. The child's lips, already blue, trembled slightly, and his breathing was so faint it was almost imperceptible. Natalie felt hot tears mingle with the rain on her face. I won't let you die here, little angel. Without a second thought, Natalie removed her only coat, a tattered garment that was her sole protection against the cold, and carefully wrapped the baby. The tiny body shook violently against her chest as she stood up, struggling against her own weakness. The high fever made the world spin around her, but a new purpose propelled her. It doesn't matter if I'm sick, if I'm weak. You're going to live, my little angel, even if it's the last thing I do in this life. With determined yet unsteady steps, Natalie crossed the parking lot again towards the emergency entrance. The rain lashed her now unprotected shoulders, but she barely felt the cold, focused solely on keeping the baby warm against her body. As she approached the glass doors, she could see the same receptionist who had expelled her earlier, and her stomach tightened with apprehension. God, please make them see that it's not for me this time. It's for this innocent child, she silently prayed, pushing the doors open with her back so as not to expose the baby to the rain. The receptionist looked up with irritation upon recognizing her, but before she could say anything, Natalie partially uncovered the baby's face. Please, I found this, she began to say, but the receptionist, however, kept her impassive expression. We don't serve the children of beggars. Go to the community hospital, a shelter, or wherever you people go when you're sick. This is a high-end hospital, not for the likes of you. Natalie's despair grew when she felt the baby have a violent spasm in her arms. The tiny body, already so cold, began to tremble in a different, frightening way. He's having a seizure. For God's sake, help, it's just an innocent child, she cried out, her legs finally giving out, making her fall to her knees on the cold reception floor. The security guard, the same one who had expelled her before, approached with heavy steps. The community hospital is on the other side of town. If you want, I can give you directions. The baby's spasms continued, growing more violent with each passing moment, as Natalie held him with all the strength she could muster. Her own tears fell on the child's purplish face as she pleaded, How can you be so cruel? He'll die if he's not treated now. You can't do this. You can't." The security guard grabbed her by the arm, starting to lift her off the ground. "I'm sorry, but those are the rules. We can't treat without documents or insurance." The baby let out a faint moan, almost inaudible, as his tiny body continued to be racked by spasms. Natalie, still on her knees on the floor and resisting the security guard's force, tried to protect the child with her own body. The people in the waiting room watched the scene with a mixture of horror and indifference, some averting their gaze, others whispering among themselves. A well-dressed lady even got up as if to help, but her husband stopped her with a firm gesture. "You'll all have the death of an innocent on your consciences. Is that what you want?" Natalie shouted, her hoarse voice echoing through the reception area. The baby's seizure worsened with every passing second, his tiny fingers contorting inside the drenched coat. Natalie could feel the icy body trembling against her chest, each spasm like a stab in her heart. The receptionist finally stood up, but only to announce in an authoritative voice, "If you don't leave immediately, we'll be forced to call the police. We can't have this commotion in our emergency room," she said as the security guard tightened his grip on Natalie's arm, practically dragging her towards the door. "Please, he's just a baby. He didn't ask to be born poor or rich," she implored, feeling her strength ebbing away. With a last remnant of energy, Natalie managed to break free from the security guard's grasp and staggered to the middle of the reception area. Her own body burned with fever, but all that mattered was the tiny being in her arms who was now barely moving. "Look at him. Look into his eyes and tell me he doesn't deserve to live just because he was found by a beggar," she shouted, uncovering the baby's face so everyone could see his purplish skin and blue lips. A passing nurse stopped for a moment, her face showing conflict, but soon hurried on her way. The baby's spasms began to subside, but not in a way that brought relief. Instead, his breathing grew fainter and fainter, almost imperceptible. Natalie could feel the life draining from that tiny body with each passing second. The security guard approached again, this time with another colleague, both determined to remove her from the premises. "Don't you understand? He's dying. Dying! How can you simply ignore that?" Her voice broke into desperate sobs. The community hospital was on the other side of town, a 2-hour walk under normal conditions, much longer with this storm and carrying a sick baby. Natalie looked at the tiny face cradled in her arms, so fragile, so innocent, and felt her heart break. "How will I make it there with you in this state, my little angel? How can I save your life if I can't even keep you warm?" She whispered to the child, her hot tears falling on the icy face. The 2 security guards now flanked her, ready to remove her by force if necessary. The baby let out another feeble moan, its tiny fingers clinging to the fabric of the tattered coat, as if begging for help. Natalie looked at the receptionist once more, who simply shook her head in denial. "I can't let you die. I can't. But how will I get help? Where can I take you?" she murmured between sobs, feeling the weight of helplessness crushing her chest. The clock on the reception wall relentlessly marked the passage of time, each precious second slipping through her fingers like the rainwater outside. The baby's little body, still occasionally trembling with weaker spasms, seemed to be losing the little warmth it had left, despite the coat wrapped around it. Natalie felt her own knees growing weak, the high fever clouding her vision. 2 hours until the community hospital. 2 hours under this storm. My God, he won't make it. He won't survive, she thought, despair growing in her chest like a suffocating wave. The sound of the rain pounding against the windows seemed to mock her situation, constantly reminding her of the storm they would have to face. The baby was growing quieter in her arms, and this quietness frightened her more than the convulsions. In the back of her feverish mind, Natalie knew that every minute of delay diminished the chances of that little life. How can such a rich city be so poor in humanity? How can there be hospitals so full of equipment and so empty of compassion? She questioned herself, her words getting lost in the hubbub of the emergency room. The security guards showed no mercy as they pushed Natalie out of the hospital. She fell heavily on the wet sidewalk, using her own body to protect the baby from the fall. The heavy rain lashed her unprotected shoulders, but her only thought was to keep the child safe. With difficulty, she managed to get up, her legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion and fever. She adjusted the soaked coat around the baby, trying to create a barrier against the relentless falling water. "I can't let you get any wetter, little angel. You're already so cold, so fragile," she whispered, curving her body over the bundle in her arms. The biting wind of the early morning turned every raindrop into icy needles against her skin. Natalie began to walk, or rather drag herself along the dark sidewalk, using the buildings as a guide. Her bare feet slipped on the wet surface, and every step was a battle against the dizziness that threatened to bring her down. The baby had stopped crying, and that silence terrified her more than anything. From time to time she would stop under some awning just to check if the child was still breathing. "Please, my love, don't give up. Keep fighting." "As long as you fight, I'll fight too," she would plead, feeling the tiny body trembling against her chest. A car slowly passed by her, and Natalie summoned the strength to raise her arm, trying to get attention. The driver merely accelerated, throwing more water from the street onto her. The despair grew in her chest as she felt the baby getting warmer and warmer in her arms. His fever was rising, as was hers. The city lights seemed to dance before her eyes, and the shadows on the corners began to take on threatening shapes. How can they be so indifferent? How can they just pass by us as if we don't exist? She muttered to herself, her voice almost lost in the noise of the storm. Her legs weakened again, making her stumble and nearly fall. The baby let out a faint whimper, so faint that for a moment Natalie thought she had imagined it. The rain now completely soaked the coat protecting the child, making it an extra weight in her already exhausted arms. A truck passed by her, and this time Natalie shouted with all the strength she could muster, "Help! Please, it's a baby. He's sick." But the vehicle continued on its way, leaving only the trail of dirty water on the sidewalk. Why doesn't anyone stop? Why doesn't anyone help even a woman carrying an innocent child? She sobbed, feeling the fever burning stronger and stronger in her body. The world around her began to spin in a frightening way. The streetlights became golden blurs in the darkness of the night, and the sounds of the city seemed distorted, as if she were submerging in deep waters. A new stumble made her hit the wall of a building, and she had to summon all her effort not to drop the precious bundle in her arms. The baby was now quiet, terribly quiet. "No, my little angel, you can't sleep now. You have to stay awake, please," Natalie begged, gently shaking the little body, but received no response. Another car passed, this time slower. Natalie staggered towards it, frantically waving with one hand while keeping the baby protected with the other. The driver, an elegant woman, looked at her through the closed car window, made the sign of the cross and accelerated, disappearing into the rainy night. The rejection hurt more than any physical pain Natalie felt. Even their charity is done from a distance, afraid of being contaminated by our misery, she thought bitterly as she resumed her tortuous walk. Her soaked clothes weighed like lead, clinging to her feverish body and further hindering her movements. The baby, once cold, now burned in her arms, his fever mingling with hers in an unbearable heat. However, a new wave of dizziness hit Natalie with full force, making the world spin violently around her. Natalie's legs gave way completely this time, and she felt her body collapsing in slow motion. With a final conscious effort, she managed to twist her body to fall on her back, protecting the baby from the impact. The cold, wet sidewalk received her exhausted body, while the rain continued to fall relentlessly on them both. "Forgive me, little angel. Forgive me for not being strong enough, for not being able to save you," were her last words before the darkness enveloped her completely. The lights of passing cars intermittently illuminated two motionless bodies on the sidewalk, a woman protectively embracing a small bundle, both soaked by the unrelenting rain. The worn coat that had once served as protection was now too heavy with water, and the baby's face, partially visible, had taken on a frightening pallor. On the dark, lonely sidewalk, only the sound of the storm witnessed the silent struggle of two lives abandoned by society. "God, if you can hear me, save at least him," was Natalie's last thought, before her consciousness faded completely. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Vivian could barely wait for the sedative to wear off before ripping the IV line from her arm. Her legs were still weak from the recent childbirth, but the adrenaline pumping through her veins propelled her forward. The private room, once so cozy, now seemed to suffocate her with its white walls and the persistent smell of antiseptic. With wobbly steps, she leaned on the furniture until she reached the door. She needed to get to the parking lot. She needed to undo what she had done. "What have I done? My God, what have I done?" she repeated to herself as her trembling hands turned the doorknob. The hallway was less busy now, but there were still nurses making their night rounds. Vivian slipped along the path she had taken hours before, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to jump out of her throat. Each step sent waves of pain through her body, reminding her of the recent birth, reminding her of the reason she was there. A nurse passed by her and frowned, clearly disapproving of her early walk. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be walking yet." But Vivian just waved briefly, continuing on her way. "I just need to get some air, but the night is suffocating in here. I won't run away." The service elevator seemed slower than ever. Each stop on the lower floors was torture. Vivian could feel the cold sweat dripping down her back, soaking her hospital gown. When she finally reached the parking lot, the rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, but the ground was still drenched. Her flip-flops made wet noises as she hurried toward the spot where she had left the baby. "Please let it still be there. Please let someone have found it," she murmured repeatedly, her prayers mingling with the sound of her hurried steps. The space between the two old vans was empty. The small blue blanket she had used lay soaked on the ground, but there was no sign of the baby. Vivian fell to her knees on the wet concrete, her trembling hands touching the abandoned fabric. The reality of what she had done was beginning to weigh on her shoulders like a ton of concrete. "Where are you? Where are you?" she shouted into the night, her voice echoing among the parked cars. Desperate, Vivian began frantically searching the area. She staggered between vehicles, peering under every car, behind every pillar. The fine rain now mingled with her tears, further blurring her vision. Her legs, already weak, threatened to give way with each step. "Someone must have found it. Someone must have found it," she repeated to herself like a mantra, trying to convince herself that she hadn't made an irreparable mistake. Vivian's frantic search led her further and further into the parking lot. The place, partially lit by yellow lights, cast dancing shadows around her, transforming every shape into a potential clue to the baby's whereabouts. Her bare feet were now bruised by the rough concrete, but she barely felt the physical pain. Her despair was greater than any discomfort. "How could I do this? How could I abandon such an innocent being?" she murmured repeatedly, her voice choked by sobs. A security guard was making his routine rounds through the parking lot, and Vivian had to hide behind a column to avoid being seen. Her heart was beating so hard she feared the sound would give her away. She waited an agonizing few minutes until he moved away, before continuing her desperate search. What if he died of cold? What if some animal? Her thoughts were interrupted by a wave of nausea so strong that she had to lean against a nearby car. Vivian's legs began to weaken, brutally reminding her that she had given birth just a few hours ago. The pain of childbirth, momentarily forgotten by the adrenaline, was now returning in full force. She could feel a warm liquid running down her legs. The stitches must have opened from the exertion. "I can't go back now. Not without knowing what happened to him," she thought, forcing herself to keep searching even though every movement was agony. An unusual commotion near the emergency room entrance caught her attention. People were gathering, talking in agitated tones about something. Vivian approached as close as she could without being noticed, trying to catch fragments of the conversations. Her heart nearly stopped when she heard someone mention a baby, but she soon realized they were talking about another situation, a homeless woman who had been kicked out of the hospital. A nurse suddenly appeared in the parking lot, looking around as if searching for someone. When her eyes met Vivian's, she hurried toward her. "Mrs. Vivian, thank God I found you. Your husband has been trying to talk to you for several minutes. We finally managed to get through to him." The mention of Benjamin made her blood run cold. He's coming," she asked in a trembling voice, feeling the weight of her decision becoming even more unbearable. The nurse firmly grasped her arm, starting to guide her back inside the hospital. Vivian cast one last desperate look at the dark parking lot, her heart torn between continuing her search and facing the reality that awaited her in her room. The rain was increasing again, erasing any trace that might have remained of her terrible decision. "Ma'am, the call is waiting, and you're bleeding. You need to get back to bed immediately," the nurse insisted, her voice professional but firm. The journey back to her room seemed to last an eternity. Each step was torture, not just physical but mainly emotional. The phone kept ringing, relentless, like an audible reminder that she would soon have to face the consequences of her actions. Vivian could feel the nurse's concerned gaze upon her, probably attributing her altered state to postpartum. What will I tell him? How will I explain? She thought frantically, as she was practically carried back to her bed. Already in the room, Vivian was practically forced to lie down while the nurse checked her stitches. The phone continued ringing, each ring echoing in her ears like an accusation. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the sheet covering her. The nurse, focused on stopping the bleeding, was saying something about rest and responsibility, but Vivian barely heard. Her thoughts were fixed on the dark parking lot, the small blue bundle, the relentless rain. How will I live with this? How will I look at Benjamin and... Her thought was interrupted by the nurse's firm voice. "Ma'am, your husband is very worried. Do you want me to answer the phone for you?" The hospital room, once so spacious and comfortable, now seemed to smother her with its white walls. The sound of rain against the window sounded like a constant judgment, reminding her of the storm that punished the outside. The nurse finished dressing the wound and extended the phone in her direction. But Vivian only closed her eyes, feigning a weakness that in reality was not so far from reality. "You need to talk to him. He's worried. He didn't know the son was being born. He explained that he was in a meeting when the phone ran out of battery. He's very worried about you, but we didn't give the news about the baby, so you need to let him know," insisted the professional, still holding the device. A particularly loud thunderclap made the room windows shake, and Vivian shrank into the bed, as if she could hide from the approaching storm of consequences. Her whole body ached, not just from the recent childbirth and the effort of the frantic search, but from a much deeper pain that was beginning to settle in her chest. The phone finally stopped ringing, only to start again seconds later with even more insistence. "Do you want me to say you're resting?" asked the nurse, her voice now softer, interpreting her silence as exhaustion. The monitoring machines next to the bed began to register an elevation in her heart rate. The nurse frowned, watching the numbers rise on the monitor. Vivian could feel the cold sweat running down her back, wetting the hospital gown already damp from the rain. Every second of silence weighed like years on her conscience. The phone continued its relentless plea, demanding a decision. I need a moment. Just a moment to think," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. The night was advancing outside, and with it grew the anguish in Vivian's chest. The sound of rain began to diminish, as if nature itself was tired of witnessing her torment. The nurse, after checking her vital signs one more time, walked towards the door. "I'll let you rest a bit, but I'll be back soon to check the stitches. The phone is within reach when you want to answer." The words hung in the air like an inevitable sentence. Alone in the room, Vivian stared at the phone as if it were a snake about to strike. Her hands gripped the sheet so tightly that her knuckles were white. The phone rang again, and she knew she couldn't postpone it any longer. With trembling fingers, she reached for the phone, feeling the weight of the decision she needed to make. "May God forgive me," she murmured to herself as her hand hovered over the device. The moment of truth had arrived, and she needed to choose, maintain the lie or confess the unforgivable. Benjamin paced back and forth in his temporary office, the cell phone glued to his ear as he tried for the 10th time to make contact with Vivian's room. The important meeting that had brought him here was completely forgotten, the documents scattered across the ignored table. His mind was focused solely on the hospital, on his wife, on the son who was being born. Through the panoramic window on the 20th floor, he could see the storm that lashed the city, making the night even darker. Why doesn't anyone answer? Why all this silence? He muttered to himself, feeling the anxiety grow with each unanswered ring. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the call was answered. Vivian's crying came before any words, a sound so deep and filled with pain that it made Benjamin freeze in his place. His hands began to tremble, and he had to lean against the table to keep from falling. The silence between the sobs was deafening, filled only by the sound of rain beating against the windows. "Vivian, love, what happened? Please talk to me." His voice came out trembling, loaded with a fear he had never felt before. The answer came interspersed with sobs, each word seeming to tear a piece of Vivian's soul. "Benjamin, our baby. He didn't make it." The world seemed to stop spinning at that moment. Benjamin felt his legs give way and collapsed into the leather chair, his entire body shaking. The phone nearly slipped from his sweaty hand, and he had to make a conscious effort to keep it by his ear. "What do you mean he didn't make it? What happened to our son?" he asked in a thin voice, as tears began to blur his vision. On the other end of the line, Vivian seemed to struggle to find the words between sobs. Her voice was trembling so much that Benjamin could barely understand some sentences. He was born, so quiet. The doctors tried everything, but he simply came into the room and didn't breathe. "Someone took him lifeless from my arms, Benjamin. They took our little angel, without us being able to say goodbye." Each word was like a stab in Benjamin's heart, who gripped the phone so tightly that his fingers were white. "Why didn't they call me before? Why didn't they warn me there were complications?" he questioned in a devastated tone, running his free hand over his tear-stained face. The storm outside seemed to mirror the emotional storm inside the office. Benjamin stood up abruptly, knocking over some papers from the table without even noticing. He began pacing in circles, his mind trying to process the devastating news. The sound of Vivian's crying continued to echo through the phone, now mixed with broken words about how the baby was perfect, how he looked like he was just sleeping. "Don't move, love. I'm coming back right now." "I don't want you to be alone at this moment," he said, already starting to gather his things with frantic movements. With trembling hands, Benjamin tried to type a message to his secretary while still keeping the phone pressed against his ear. The sound of Vivian's crying was the only thing keeping him connected to reality at that moment. The cell phone screen became blurred with tears that wouldn't stop falling from his eyes. "Cancel all appointments. Family emergency," was all he could write before his vision became completely blurred by pain. The city lights shone through the office window, distorted by the rain streaming down the glass. Benjamin could barely concentrate on gathering his belongings, his hands dropping objects as he tried to put everything in his briefcase. Vivian continued crying on the other end of the line, her voice now weaker, as if she were losing herself to exhaustion. "Don't hang up, love. Stay with me on the line." "I'm going there right now," he pleaded, his heart broken at the sound of his wife's suffering. The building's security guard widened his eyes as he saw Benjamin rushing out of the elevator, his face marked by tears and his tie askew. The briefcase in his hands was barely closed, important papers threatening to fall with every hurried step he took towards the exit. The rain continued to fall relentlessly outside, but he barely noticed. "Mr. Benjamin, do you want me to call your driver?" the guard asked, concerned about the usually composed businessman's state. "He's already waiting for me." "I need to get to the hospital as quickly as possible," Benjamin replied, his voice choked with emotion. The driver was already waiting for him with the limousine door open, sheltering him from the rain with an umbrella. Benjamin practically threw himself into the back seat, his whole body trembling with the force of the sobs he could no longer contain. "To the hospital as fast as possible," he ordered, running his hands over his face wet with tears and rain. The car began to move through the dark city, the raindrops beating against the windows as he couldn't get his mind off his lost son, his Adam. The streets were partially flooded, forcing the driver to reduce speed several times. Benjamin felt each second like an eternity, his mind reliving the last months of expectation, the preparations for the baby's room, the dreams he had built for his firstborn. "Faster, please." "I need to get to her," he murmured, watching through the fogged windows as people ran to take shelter from the storm. The limousine advanced slowly through the flooded streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the rainy night. Benjamin kept his eyes fixed on the urban landscape that passed like a blur through the fogged windows, his mind tortured by thoughts of the son he would never know. The phone in his hands was still warm from the long conversation with Vivian, which had ended minutes before when she finally succumbed to exhaustion. "How will I enter that room and look at the empty crib?" he muttered to himself, feeling a new wave of tears threatening to fall. A red light forced the car to stop, and Benjamin watched the people hurrying on the sidewalks, all immersed in their own lives, oblivious to his searing pain. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, but the cold of the night seemed to have intensified. The city lights reflected in the puddles, creating a display of colors that he could barely appreciate. "Sir, would you like me to take an alternate route? This stretch usually floods," the driver asked, his voice laced with concern. Before Benjamin could answer, something caught his attention on the sidewalk to the right. A staggering figure stood out in the gloom, a woman who could barely keep herself upright, carrying something in her arms. His heart, already broken by recent loss, tightened even more as he realized she was protecting what appeared to be a baby with her own body. "Stop the car," Benjamin ordered, his newly awakened paternal instinct momentarily making him forget his own pain. The driver barely had time to pull over when the woman began to sway dangerously. Benjamin already had his hand on the door handle, ready to get out, when he saw the exact moment she lost her balance. It was like watching a scene in slow motion. She still tried to protect the little bundle in her arms as she fell, her body twisting to absorb the impact of the fall. "My God!" Benjamin exclaimed, his heart pounding in his chest as he rushed out of the car. The scene he found on the sidewalk made his blood run cold. The woman was lying unconscious, but still had her arms firmly wrapped around the baby. The fine drizzle continued to fall, making her dark hair cling to her pale, feverish face. The small bundle in her arms let out a weak whimper, so faint that for a moment Benjamin thought he had imagined it. "Help me here, quick!" he shouted to the driver, kneeling beside the two fallen bodies. Benjamin leaned over the unconscious woman, trying to shield her from the drizzle with his own body. His hands were trembling as he touched her face. It was burning with fever. The baby in her arms, still firmly protected even in unconsciousness, was also radiating a worrying heat. The driver rushed over with an umbrella, but Benjamin barely noticed his presence, focused on trying to wake the stranger. "Mom? Mom, can you hear me?" he called, gently tapping her face, but received only a faint moan in response. The street was practically deserted at that hour of the night, and the fine drizzle made everything even darker. Benjamin tried again. "Please wake up, I need to know how to help you." His words were met only by the sound of the woman's irregular breathing and a very faint cry from the baby. He touched the child's forehead and his heart clenched. The fever seemed even higher than the woman's. "The mansion is only 5 minutes away. The nearest hospital is at least half an hour in this traffic," the driver said, voicing aloud the thoughts already occupying Benjamin's mind. Carefully, Benjamin tried to separate the baby from the woman's arms, but even unconscious, she held it with surprising strength. It was as if, even in her feverish state, her protective instinct remained active. "We'll need to take them both together. Help me carry them to the car," he ordered the driver, who was already positioning himself to assist. "We need to take them to the mansion," Benjamin said, as he gently lifted the woman off the ground, the baby still nestled in her arms. With precise movements despite the urgency, Benjamin and the driver managed to accommodate the two bodies in the back seat of the limousine. The woman kept the baby firmly against her chest, even in her unconsciousness, as if her maternal instinct overrode the high fever. Benjamin positioned himself beside them, noting how their drenched clothes were beginning to wet the leather seat. Taking his phone with trembling hands, he dialed the mansion. "Please prepare the guest room immediately. I'm bringing 2 people in critical condition. We'll need towels, dry clothes, and warm water. Hello? Hello?" The phone remained silent, increasing his anxiety even more. The limousine advanced through the rainy night, cutting through pools of water that formed in the partially flooded streets. The baby let out such a weak moan that Benjamin had to lean in to be sure he had heard it. He touched the child's forehead again. The fever seemed even higher than before. "How can such a small being survive so much?" he muttered to himself as he dialed the manor's number again, desperate to ensure that someone would be prepared to receive them. In the front seat, the driver maneuvered the car skillfully between the dark streets, choosing the least flooded paths. At each turn, Benjamin protected the 2 bodies in his lap so they wouldn't move abruptly. The woman began to murmur disconnected words in her feverish delirium, her purplish fingers clutching the small bundle even tighter against herself. "I need one of the servants to answer this phone. Please answer," Benjamin whispered as he tried for the 3rd time to make contact with the manor, the growing panic in his voice. The imposing gates of the manor finally appeared through the curtain of rain, their security lights casting ghostly shadows in the stormy night. Benjamin could feel the alarming heat emanating from the 2 bodies. The fever seemed to be increasing with every passing minute. The baby hadn't made a sound in the last few moments, and that worried him more than anything else. "Someone has to be awake in the manor. Someone has to be waiting," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the darkened windows of the house. The limousine came to an abrupt stop at the main entrance, and the silence from the manor was deafening. There was no sign of Maria or any other servant. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, and Benjamin knew they couldn't wait any longer. "Help me get them inside. We're going to have to fend for ourselves," he ordered the driver, already beginning to carefully move the woman's body, which even unconscious did not loosen its protective grip around the baby. With difficulty, they managed to get the two out of the car. The woman weighed more than she appeared with all her soaked clothes, and the baby remained firmly held in her arms. Benjamin tried to shield them from the rain, while frantically searching for the keys to the front door. "Where is everyone? Why isn't anyone answering?" he questioned aloud. The mansion was plunged into darkness when they finally managed to enter. The echo of their footsteps reverberated through the empty corridors as they carried the two bodies towards the main staircase. Benjamin could feel the heat of fever from both of them through his own already drenched clothes. "We need to take them to the guest room. It's the only one already prepared," he said, his voice echoing in the silent house. At the very moment they reached the foot of the stairs, lights began to turn on upstairs. An elderly housekeeper hurriedly descended the steps, still adjusting her uniform, followed by two younger maids carrying piles of towels. Benjamin felt a brief relief upon seeing them, but there was no time for explanations. "Prepare the guest room immediately. Hot water, extra blankets, everything you can find," he ordered, as he and the driver began climbing the staircase with their precious burden. The maids ran ahead, opening doors and turning on lights. The second-floor corridor came alive with the frantic bustle of staff emerging from their quarters, alerted by the commotion. One of the older chambermaids let out a muffled exclamation upon seeing the state of the woman and baby. "Mercy! How can they be in such a state on a night like this?" But Benjamin merely continued on his way toward the room, every second seeming an eternity. The guest room was rapidly being transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Warm blankets and towels were piled on the king-size bed, while one of the maids turned on the heater to maximum temperature. Benjamin tried once more to separate the baby from the woman's arms, who even in her unconscious state resisted. "We need to dry and warm them separately. Please help me here," he pleaded, noticing how the tiny body of the baby seemed quieter and quieter. The housekeeper approached with a basin of warm water and clean compresses. Her experienced hands finally managed, with surprising gentleness, to loosen the woman's grip around the baby. Benjamin immediately took the child in his arms, his heart nearly stopping upon feeling how cold the tiny body was, despite the fever. "He's very quiet, too quiet," he murmured, as one of the maids unfolded a heated towel to wrap around the baby. While the staff tended to the unknown woman, changing her drenched clothes for a dry nightgown, Benjamin focused on the baby. With careful motions, he began removing the layers of wet fabric enveloping him. The pale little face showed no reaction to the touch, its lips taking on a purplish hue that made Benjamin's blood run cold. Why isn't he crying? Her baby should be crying, he questioned aloud. It was at that moment that his heart nearly stopped. The baby wasn't breathing. "The baby isn't breathing!" Benjamin's desperate scream echoed through the mansion, making everyone freeze for a second. Without wasting time, he laid the tiny body on the bed and began performing reanimation maneuvers with trembling fingers, gently pressing the small chest as he had learned in a first aid course years ago. "It can't end like this. It can't," he murmured between compressions, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to save that fragile life. The housekeeper quickly ordered someone to call an ambulance, while the other maids watched the scene paralyzed. Benjamin continued the reanimation maneuvers, his heart pounding in his chest with enough force to ache. After what seemed an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, the baby let out a small sigh, followed by a weak cry. "Thank God, but he needs a hospital immediately," exclaimed Benjamin, already picking up the tiny body in his arms again. The unknown woman, even in her feverish state, seemed to sense that something was wrong. She began to stir on the bed, her hands frantically searching around her, her lips murmuring incomprehensible words. Benjamin knew he couldn't separate them. "Let's take them both. Help me carry her to the car," he ordered, as he kept the baby firmly pressed against his chest, monitoring every little breath as if his own life depended on it. Within minutes, they were all back in the limousine, now cutting through the rainy night at high speed toward the nearest hospital. Benjamin kept the baby close to his body, trying to warm him, while watching the child's irregular breathing. The woman lay on the seat, her head resting on the lap of one of the maids who insisted on accompanying them. "Faster, he's barely breathing," Benjamin shouted to the driver, feeling the little body in his arms growing weaker and weaker. The journey to the hospital seemed endless. Every red light was torture, every detour an eternity. Benjamin alternated his attention between the baby in his arms and the unconscious woman, both fighting to survive. A sudden thought struck him like lightning. He needed to let Vivian know he wouldn't be coming to the hospital where she was anymore. But how to explain this situation? How to say he was taking an unknown baby to the emergency room when he was supposedly on his way to care for her after losing their child? The nearest hospital was not the one his wife wanted to have their child in. It was a hospital on the other side of the city, and if he went there, the baby and the unknown woman would likely not survive. Vivian, my God, what will I tell her? He murmured to himself, feeling the weight of two different realities colliding in his chest. The limousine finally arrived at the hospital emergency room, its wheels skidding on the wet asphalt. Benjamin didn't wait for the car to come to a complete stop. He opened the door and jumped out with the baby in his arms, shouting for help even before crossing the automatic doors. "It's an emergency. The baby stopped breathing a few minutes ago." His voice echoed through the lobby, immediately prompting the medical team into action. A sharp pain pierced his chest as he remembered that he couldn't do anything for his own son, but now he had the chance to save this little life. A team of doctors quickly surrounded Benjamin, taking the baby from his arms and placing it on an emergency stretcher. Meanwhile, two nurses ran to the limousine to help transport the unknown woman. Even in her feverish state, she began to struggle as she realized they were taking the baby away. "The baby? Where's the baby?" Her voice came out weak and hoarse, but laden with despair. Benjamin rushed to her side. "They're going to take care of him, I promise, but you also need medical attention." The doctors worked frantically on the baby's tiny body, connecting monitors and preparing resuscitation equipment. The woman continued trying to get up from the stretcher, her glassy eyes fixed in the direction where they had taken the child. Benjamin held her hand, trying to calm her down. "I won't let anything happen to him. Trust me." The touch seemed to momentarily soothe her, although her lips continued to murmur inaudible pleas. As the two medical teams split up to attend to the emergencies, Benjamin found himself alone in the hospital corridor. The weight of the night's events finally began to settle on his shoulders. Vivian would be waiting for him at the other hospital, unaware of his delay. He stared at the phone in his trembling hands for long moments before managing to dial the number. "How do I tell her I'm here, trying to save another baby, when I couldn't do anything for ours?" He muttered to himself, feeling the weight of guilt in every word. Vivian's voice answered on the third ring, sounding strangely composed. "Benjamin?" He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the frantic movement of the medical team through the emergency room's glass. "Love, there was an emergency. I found a baby and a dying woman on the street. I had to bring them to the hospital." The silence on the other end of the line seemed to weigh tons. When Vivian finally responded, her voice sounded different, almost unrecognizable. "You don't need to come. Your brother is already taking me home." Benjamin frowned, a strange chill running down his spine. There was something in her voice, something he couldn't identify, but that made all his instincts alert that something was very wrong, yet she hung up before he could respond. Suddenly, the heart monitors began to emit alarming sounds in sequence, their shrill beeps cutting through the tense air of the emergency room. Benjamin watched through the glass as the medical team worked frantically on the baby's tiny body, which had stopped breathing again. The professionals' experienced hands seemed to move in slow motion as they prepared the resuscitation equipment, each second an eternity of agony. "Please fight. You've already survived once tonight," Benjamin murmured, his hands pressed together in prayer to help. On the other side of the corridor, the unknown woman's situation was also deteriorating rapidly. Her fever had reached critical levels, and her body was shaking violently on the stretcher. The nurses struggled to keep her stable as she continued trying to get up, her glassy eyes fixed in the direction where the baby was. Benjamin found himself torn between the two emergencies, his heart aching to see so much suffering. "How did we get to this point? How can one night change so many lives?" he thought, watching the chaos unfold before his eyes. The sound of the baby's heart monitor changed drastically, turning into a single continuous tone that made Benjamin's blood run cold. The medical team immediately began resuscitation maneuvers, one of the doctors climbing onto the stretcher to perform chest compressions on the tiny chest. "We're not getting a response. Prepare the adrenaline," the doctor shouted, his words echoing down the corridor like a death sentence. Benjamin felt his legs grow weak, needing to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The doctors now worked in increasingly urgent movements over the baby's tiny body. The chest compressions continued without interruption, while a nurse manually pumped air into the tiny lungs. Benjamin could see the sweat pouring down the professionals' foreheads, their tense faces betraying the gravity of the situation. "It's been 2 minutes. Increase the adrenaline dose," the doctor ordered, his voice betraying the concern he tried to hide. Why isn't anything working? Benjamin thought, his own heart seeming to stop with every second that passed. The emergency corridor had turned into a nightmare scene. On one side, the team fought to revive the baby. On the other, nurses tried to stabilize the woman who was now experiencing violent convulsions due to her extremely high fever. Benjamin found himself in the middle of this chaos, spinning between one emergency and the other, feeling completely helpless. "Somebody do something. We can't lose them both," he shouted, his voice choked by the despair growing in his chest. The nurse caring for the unknown woman ran into the baby's room, her urgent voice cutting through the tense air. "Doctor, the patient is going into shock. Her temperature won't stop rising." The doctor, still performing chest compressions on the baby, looked from one side to the other, the conflict evident on his face. Benjamin felt his stomach churn as he realized there was only one full emergency team on duty. "Why is this happening? How can they have to choose between 2 lives?" he muttered, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair in despair. The doctor finally stopped compressions for a moment, his grave face turning to Benjamin. The baby's heart monitor continued to emit that anguished sound, while in the background, the sounds of the woman's convulsions could be heard. His next words fell like stones in the sudden silence that formed. "Sir, we only have one full emergency team tonight. I need you to decide, which one of the 2 should we try to save first?" Time seemed to freeze in that moment. Benjamin looked from one side of the hallway to the other, his brain struggling to process the impossible decision he needed to make. The baby, so small and fragile, had not yet lived any of his life. The woman who had fought so hard to protect him deserved the chance to see him grow. "How can I choose? How can anyone make a choice like that?" His voice came out strangled, as the sound of the 2 heart monitors blended into a macabre chorus of urgency. The doctor kept his eyes fixed on Benjamin, his hands still poised over the baby's small chest, ready to resume compressions. In the other room, the woman's convulsions seemed to worsen, her movements so violent that 2 nurses could barely restrain her. Benjamin closed his eyes for a second, the memory of his own lost son weighing on his decision. It's just a baby. So small, so innocent. He needs a chance, he thought, his words broken by emotion. The seconds dragged like hours as the team awaited his response. The unknown woman's face was growing paler, contrasting with the intense red of the fever consuming her body. The baby remained motionless on the stretcher, its tiny body seeming even smaller under the cold emergency lights. "I can't let another child die tonight. I can't," Benjamin muttered, taking a decisive step toward the doctor. With a trembling yet firm voice, Benjamin made his choice. Save the baby first. The words had barely left his lips when the team sprang back into action, resuming the urgent cardiac compressions. One of the nurses ran to fetch more medication, while another prepared the infant defibrillator. Benjamin felt his legs give way, sliding down the wall until he sat on the cold floor of the corridor. "God forgive me. May she forgive me if she survives," he whispered, watching the woman continue her solitary struggle against the fever. The shrill, continuous beep of the baby's heart monitor was the only thing Benjamin could hear now, piercing his eardrums like sharp needles. The medical team worked in perfect synchrony, like a macabre orchestra battling death. Down the hallway, the woman's convulsion began to subside, but not in the way everyone hoped. Her movements were growing weaker, her eyes rolling back in their sockets. "Please hold on." "They both need to hold on," Benjamin pleaded, his words lost in the chaos of the emergency. The minutes dragged like hours as the medical team continued frantically working on the tiny baby's body. The resuscitation attempt seemed like a morbid dance. Compressions, medications, infant defibrillator shocks, but the heart monitor kept showing ever weaker signs of life. Benjamin watched it all through the glass, his hands pressed against the cold surface as if he could pass through to help. "Why isn't anything working? Why isn't he responding?" he muttered repeatedly, his voice choked with despair. The lead doctor shook his head in frustration after another failed attempt to stabilize the baby's vital signs. His eyes met Benjamin's through the glass, and there was something in that look that made the businessman's blood run cold. With precise gestures, the doctor ordered the team to continue the maneuvers while he stepped out to speak with Benjamin. "Conventional treatment isn't being enough. We need to make a difficult decision," he said, his grave tone making Benjamin hold his breath. The emergency room transformed into a whirlwind of even more intense activity. Nurses rushed back and forth, preparing equipment Benjamin had never seen before. The sound of the monitors kept changing, each irregular beep seeming like a countdown to the worst. "Mr. Benjamin, the baby isn't responding to the initial treatment. He needs advanced life support to survive," the doctor explained, his words heavy as lead in the tense emergency air. Benjamin's eyes fixed on the tiny body on the stretcher, so fragile amidst all the medical equipment. The doctor continued his explanation, each word sounding like a sentence. "We need to intubate him immediately and connect him to special life support machines. It's an invasive and risky procedure in a newborn, but it's his only chance." Benjamin felt his stomach churn, remembering the promise he'd made to the unknown woman to keep the baby safe. What's the risk of this procedure?" he asked, his voice trembling as he formed the words. The heart monitor issued a new alarm, making the entire medical team turn their attention back to the plummeting vitals. One of the nurses increased the pace of manual compressions on the baby's tiny lungs, while another hurriedly prepared the intubation kit. The doctor grasped Benjamin's arm firmly. "We don't have much time to decide. His lungs are failing, and without the special machines, he won't make it." The businessman could feel the weight of that decision crushing his chest. The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed even brighter now, reflecting off the sweat beading on the medical team's foreheads as they fought to keep the baby alive. Benjamin watched every move, every frustrated attempt to stabilize that little life. On the other side of the corridor, even sedated, the unknown woman seemed to sense that something was wrong. Her body stirred slightly on the stretcher, as if responding to the baby's agony. "How can I make this decision alone? What if something goes wrong?" Benjamin thought, feeling the weight of responsibility like never before. The doctor checked the baby's vital signs once more, his face showing growing concern. The team had already prepared all the necessary equipment for intubation, awaiting only the go-ahead to proceed. Time seemed to slip like sand through fingers, each lost second diminishing the child's chances of survival. "Mr. Benjamin, I need your decision now. Without the special machines, we won't be able to keep him alive much longer." The doctor's voice cut through the tense air like a blade. A nurse hurried over, clutching a clipboard with various forms. The baby let out a whimper so faint it was barely audible, its tiny body struggling for every minuscule amount of oxygen. Benjamin looked through the glass one more time, watching that silent battle for life. "If he dies because I hesitated. If I don't give him every possible chance." His words hung in the air, laden with an almost palpable anguish. Benjamin raised his eyes with determination. "Do whatever it takes to save him." The words had barely left his lips when the medical team began to move with renewed urgency. The tiny baby's body looked even smaller amid the equipment now surrounding it. Benjamin watched every movement through the glass, his hands pressed against the cold surface as if they could pass through to offer some comfort. How can someone so small have to fight so hard to survive? He thought, feeling his throat tighten with contained emotion. The intubation procedure began with precise and calculated movements from the medical team. The tube, as thin as a strand of spaghetti, seemed absurdly large next to the baby's tiny mouth. Benjamin held his breath as the doctor began the insertion, but something was wrong. The baby's body instantly rejected the tube, its tiny limbs writhing in protest as the monitors blared deafening alerts. "The airway is too compromised," warned one of the nurses, her tense voice cutting the air like a razor. A second intubation attempt was equally unsuccessful. The doctor maintained his composure, but Benjamin could see growing concern in his experienced eyes. The baby now displayed an even more alarming coloration, its lips taking on a bluish tint that made Benjamin's stomach churn. The monitors continued their chorus of alerts, each sound seeming more urgent than the last. "Why isn't it working? What's happening?" Benjamin questioned, his voice choked with despair. The doctor finally stepped back from the gurney, motioning for Benjamin to approach. His face was grave as he began to speak. "The normal procedure isn't working. There's a complication we didn't anticipate." Benjamin felt his legs weaken, needing to lean against the wall to stay upright. A nurse rushed to grab another clipboard as the doctor continued. "There's an alternative procedure, but the risk is extremely high." The surgical center was immersed in an almost palpable tension as Benjamin stared at the new authorization form in his trembling hands. Every word on the document seemed to jump out at him, especially the terms high-risk procedure and possibility of death during transfer. The pen danced between his unsteady fingers, leaving his signature almost unrecognizable on the paper. The doctor watched with a mixture of understanding and urgency, knowing every second was precious. "If we don't do this now, he won't make it. But if something goes wrong during the transfer..." Benjamin's words died in his throat. From the other room, the feverish cries of the unknown woman echoed, her hoarse voice desperately calling for the baby. The sounds of her anguish pierced the hospital walls like arrows, making Benjamin grip the pen in his hand even tighter. The nurses tried to restrain her in her delirium, but she kept fighting, her arms outstretched toward the surgical center, as if she could sense the child's presence. The baby. Where is the baby? Her cries grew weaker, more desperate, cutting through the heart of everyone who heard them. The medical team moved with calculated precision around the tiny body, preparing every detail of the transfer to the special equipment. The doctor had explained the risks of the procedure in detail. The baby's heart might not withstand the change. Its lungs could fail during the transition. Every movement was a calculated risk against death. Benjamin watched each preparation, his own heart seeming to stop with each new piece of equipment connected to the tiny body. The nurses worked in perfect synchronicity, each one knowing exactly their role in that delicate choreography of life and death. Tubes and wires were methodically arranged, each connection checked 2-3 times before the transfer. The baby's tiny body looked even smaller, surrounded by so much equipment, its pale skin contrasting with the blue of the surgical drapes. Benjamin barely breathed as he observed the preparations, his hands now gripping the railing of the observation area with such force that his knuckles were white. So many machines. "It looks more like a machine than a child," he thought, feeling a wave of nausea rise in his throat. The woman's cries in the other room had turned into broken pleas, her voice growing weaker due to the high fever. The nurses attending her reported that her temperature continued to rise despite all medication. Benjamin could hear the desperation in her calls for the baby, each word laden with a love and anguish that seemed capable of piercing the hospital walls. "If she survives and he doesn't, how will I explain that I was the one who authorized this?" The anticipated guilt weighed on his chest like lead. The attending physician made one final check with the team, his precise words cutting through the tense air of the operating room. "The most critical moment will be in the first 30 seconds of the transfer. We need to be fast and precise." The machines that would keep the baby alive hummed softly in the background, their lights blinking like cold stars in that sterile setting. The team positioned themselves strategically around the gurney, each one knowing there was no margin for error. The moment of transfer arrived with an almost electric tension in the air. The experienced hands of the medical team moved in a synchronized dance, disconnecting and reconnecting tubes and sensors with millimetric precision. The tiny baby's body was handled with extreme care, each movement calculated to minimize the stress of the procedure. Benjamin held his breath as the first tube was transferred, his eyes fixed on the monitors displaying the child's vital signs. It was then that it happened. At the exact moment the baby was being connected to the new respirator, all the monitors began blaring alerts simultaneously. The shrill, continuous sound indicating cardiac arrest filled the operating room, making Benjamin's blood run cold in his veins. "No, not now!" the doctor shouted, immediately beginning resuscitation maneuvers on the motionless tiny chest. Chaos ensued in the operating room in a matter of seconds. The doctor's hands, once so steady and precise, now rhythmically pressed the baby's tiny thorax, each compression seeming too large for such a small body. The nurses moved in a frenzied dance around the gurney, one preparing the emergency medication, another adjusting the infant defibrillator to the lowest possible charge. Benjamin watched everything paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the monitor showing only a flat line, the continuous sound piercing his eardrums like needles. What did I do? What choice was that I made? His voice came out in a broken whisper as tears blurred his vision. From the other room, as if sensing the emergency, the woman's screams became more intense, more desperate. Her hoarse voice cut through the air like a razor. "Save the baby!" "I can feel. Something is wrong." The nurses tried to restrain her on the bed, but even in her feverish state, she struggled with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical. Benjamin felt each of her words like a blow to his chest, guilt growing in his heart like a poisonous shadow. How will I live if these are her last words about her son? He thought, his hands trembling violently as he leaned against the wall. The doctor continued the compressions without stopping, drops of sweat running down his focused face. The most experienced nurse had already connected the adrenaline to the access line, only waiting for the command to inject. The seconds dragged like hours, each movement of the team seeming to happen in slow motion. "Come on, little warrior. You've already survived so much tonight," the doctor murmured between compressions, his words almost a prayer amidst the chaos of sounds and movements. The infant defibrillator emitted the sound of a full charge, its light blinking like a silent warning. The nurse positioned herself with the tiny paddles, as small as the baby's hands, waiting for the doctor's command. The tension in the room was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Benjamin held his breath, his eyes alternating between the cardiac monitor and the motionless body on the stretcher. "Please, God, don't let my decision have been his sentence," he silently pleaded, feeling the weight of each passing second. A new sound cut through the air. The woman's distant cry had turned into a shrill scream, as if she could feel exactly what was happening to the child. The hospital walls seemed to vibrate with her agony, echoing the despair of a mother who, even without knowing, was connected to the drama unfolding in the surgical center. Benjamin squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't block out the sounds. Neither her crying, nor the constant beep of the monitor, nor the doctor's urgent orders. "Clear!" the doctor shouted, preparing to deliver the shock that could be the baby's last chance. The silence that followed the doctor's command was deafening. The tiny body of the baby arched on the stretcher as the electric discharge passed through its heart. Benjamin held his breath, his nails digging into his palms with such force they nearly broke the skin. The seconds seemed to drag like hours, as all eyes in the room were fixed on the cardiac monitor. "Please, little warrior, you've already survived the cold, the rain, and the abandonment. Don't give up now that you finally have a chance," he whispered, his voice choked with the emotion that threatened to overflow. The monitor remained flat for a few more agonizing seconds before a small peak appeared, followed by another and another. The medical team worked with renewed energy, moving in perfect sync to stabilize the child's vital signs. The nurses adjusted the special equipment while the doctor monitored every response from the tiny patient. Sweat poured down the professionals' foreheads, mixing with the relief that was beginning to spread through the environment. "It's a true miracle," the most experienced nurse murmured. The following minutes were crucial as the team worked to ensure that all the special equipment was functioning properly. The baby, now connected to a complex network of tubes and monitors, began to show more stable signs. Its color gradually improved, and its heartbeats found a more regular rhythm. Benjamin watched every movement, every adjustment, feeling his own heart beating in sync with the beeps of the monitor. "Doctor, please tell me the worst is over. I can't bear to see more suffering in this child. I lost my son today. I didn't even have time to process my grief when I helped this boy. Just tell me he'll be okay," he pleaded, his words laden with an emotion that surprised even himself. The doctor stepped away momentarily from the monitor to face Benjamin, his face showing a mixture of compassion and professional seriousness. The fluorescent lights of the ICU reflected off his glasses as he carefully chose his words. Years of experience had taught him that, in moments like this, the truth needed to be told with equal doses of honesty and hope. Mr. Benjamin, his vital signs are stabilizing and the equipment is responding well. He's a fighter. He survived the cold, the rain, and now cardiac arrest. I can't promise there won't be more scares, but I can say that this little warrior is showing a will to live that I haven't seen in a long time in my career. If he continues like this, I believe he has a great chance of making a full recovery." From the other room, the sounds of Natalie's agitation had decreased considerably. The fever was starting to subside to the medication, allowing her mind to emerge from the delirium that had consumed her for so many hours. Her eyes, once glassy and distant, now focused on the environment around her with increasing lucidity. The nurse caring for her noticed the immediate change in her behavior. "The baby? Where is the baby that was with me? Please tell me he's okay," she asked, her voice hoarse but determined to get answers. Natalie's question echoed down the hallway, reaching Benjamin's ears as he, after making sure the baby was stable, headed to her room. His legs still trembled from the intensity of the recent events, but something in that woman's voice compelled him to go to her. He approached the bedside with cautious steps, watching as she tried to sit up despite her obvious weakness. "Your son is alive," he said softly. "Thanks to your courage in protecting him with your own body during the storm. My name is Benjamin. I found you both on the road." Natalie closed her eyes for a moment, letting tears of relief stream freely down her face. When she opened them again, there was a steely determination in her gaze that surprised everyone in the room. Her hands gripped the sheet tightly as she gathered courage to tell the truth. "The baby, he is not my son, but I am responsible for taking care of him," she confessed, her voice trembling with the intensity of the memory. Benjamin felt his heart tighten with the revelation, his mind momentarily returning to his own lost son on that same night. The pain of his personal loss was still too recent, but seeing the unconditional love of this woman for a child that was not her blood awoke in him a profound admiration. The storm outside had ceased, but the strength of that connection between Natalie and the baby seemed stronger than any inclement weather. Fate works in mysterious ways. "You almost died of fever, trying to protect this child in the midst of the storm. That shows more maternal love than many people who had 9 months to prepare," he said, his voice laden with admiration and respect for that woman who, having nothing, had given everything to save a life. The doctor entered the room at that moment, his face showing the weariness of hours of intense work, but with a slight smile that brought hope. He approached Natalie's bed, checking her vital signs before sharing the news. His professional expression could not completely hide the astonishment at the story he had just heard. "You had a very high fever that could have been fatal, but like the baby, you too are a fighter. You are both stable now," he informed, his tone blending relief and admiration. Benjamin took a step forward, his posture demonstrating the decision he had just made. The story of that woman and the child had touched something deep in his heart, especially after the recent loss of his own son. He looked into Natalie's eyes, seeing in them the same unconditional love that the baby had awakened in him. "I want to help you take care of this child. No one who risks their own life for a baby should go through this alone, without a home and ways to care for him," he declared, his voice firm and determined. The doctor cleared his throat softly, calling attention from both of them. His face took on a more serious expression as he adjusted his glasses on his nose. The next information was crucial and needed to be conveyed clearly. "The baby is responding well to treatments, but his condition is still delicate. He will need special care, specific equipment, and constant monitoring when discharged," he explained, detailing the necessary procedures to ensure the child's full recovery. Natalie tried to sit up again in bed, this time managing it with Benjamin's help. Her eyes shone with a mixture of determination and concern as she absorbed the doctor's words. The thought of the child needing special care frightened her, not because of the responsibility, but because of her financial condition. "How will I be able to provide all that? I don't even have a place to live," she murmured, her voice laden with anguish and helplessness. Benjamin placed a gentle hand on Natalie's shoulder, a simple gesture but laden with meaning. His mind was already working on practical solutions to the situation, planning how he could help without hurting the pride of that woman who had shown such strength. "Don't worry about that now. I have resources and I want to help. Consider this not as charity, but as a partnership to ensure the well-being of this child who has already won our hearts, he offered, his voice gentle but resolute. The doctor observed the interaction with professional interest, making notes on his clipboard as he spoke. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when fate conspired to create something extraordinary out of tragedy. I will prepare a complete list of the necessary equipment and care. The baby will need to stay in the ICU for at least a few more hours before we can consider discharge, he informed, his voice blending professionalism with a touch of hope. The sunlight began to penetrate through the hospital windows, marking the beginning of a new day. Natalie looked at Benjamin, then at the doctor, feeling for the first time in a long time that perhaps there was a higher purpose in all her suffering. Her hands, once trembling, now closed with determination on the sheet. "When can I see him? I need to see with my own eyes that he is really okay," she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of anxiety and hope that touched the heart of everyone in the room. The doctor consulted his watch, pondering the situation for a moment before answering. The morning sun was casting dancing shadows on the white walls of the room, as if celebrating the miracle that had happened during the stormy night. "As soon as we finish adjusting all the ICU equipment and you are a little stronger, you can visit him," the doctor replied, his voice conveying not only medical information, but also admiration for the strength of spirit he had witnessed on that extraordinary night. Benjamin looked at the doctor with a determined expression of someone who knew what needed to be done. His eyes met the doctor's as he straightened his rumpled suit from the tense night. "Doctor, I will provide a private medical team and all the necessary resources in my mansion. I can provide the same ICU equipment and even more modern ones if necessary. How long do you need to prepare the baby's transfer?" "My wife. She lost a child. I need to be with her. But I cannot abandon this child and this woman here either. I have resources to provide for both to be assisted in my home now that the worst is over. When can we start?" he asked, his firm voice leaving no room for arguments. The doctor adjusted his glasses, carefully analyzing the proposal. His years of experience made him cautious with transfers of such delicate patients, but he also knew how to recognize when an exceptional opportunity presented itself. His fingers drummed on the clipboard as he considered the risks and benefits. "With the proper resources and a specialized team available 24 hours, we could make the transfer tonight. But I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. The baby will need constant monitoring, and any change in their vital signs could mean an emergency," he explained, his voice blending professionalism with genuine concern. Benjamin immediately began making calls, mobilizing his team to turn an entire wing of the mansion into a private neonatal ICU. His fingers typed out quick messages as he alternated between urgent calls and precise instructions. The fatigue from the previous night seemed to have vanished, replaced by an almost frantic energy. "I need you to prepare the blue room and the adjacent one immediately. Call the best nursing team we can hire. Don't worry about costs, just make sure everything is perfect in a few hours," he ordered, his voice conveying the urgency of the situation. The path to the mansion was made in a silence laden with expectation. Benjamin watched through the limousine window as the city awoke, his mind a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. The joy of being able to help Natalie and the baby mingled with the searing pain of his own loss, which he was only now really beginning to process. Silent tears streamed down his face as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. "How can I be feeling so much pain and so much hope at the same time? My son, my little Adam. Forgive me for not being there when you needed me," he whispered to himself, his voice choked with emotion that was finally overflowing. The mansion was in an uproar when Benjamin arrived. Staff were rushing back and forth, carrying medical equipment and furniture. The blue room, traditionally reserved for important guests, was being completely transformed into a small private medical center. The walls had already been sanitized, and a specialized team was installing the monitors and life support equipment. "I want everything ready as quickly as possible, and prepare the adjacent room for Mrs. Natalie. She will need to be close to the baby during recovery," he instructed, observing every detail with critical eyes. It was then that the sound of a slamming door caught his attention. Vivian was standing in the hallway, still wearing her hospital gown, her face a mask of disbelief and something else Benjamin couldn't quite identify. Her eyes roamed over all the commotion before settling on her husband. "What is happening here?" Why are you bringing strangers into our home on the day we lost our son? She questioned, her voice strangely controlled for someone who should be devastated by the loss of a child. Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine at his wife's tone of voice. Something in the way she spoke, the absence of tears, her tense posture. Everything seemed out of place for a grieving mother. He approached her with cautious steps, as if nearing a frightened animal. Vivian, I found a woman and a baby dying on the street during the storm. I couldn't leave them without help. Not after. After what happened with our Adam, he explained, his voice faltering as he spoke his son's name. Natalie's arrival interrupted the tense moment between the couple. She was brought in a wheelchair, still visibly weak, with a persistent cough that seemed to shake her whole body. The nurse accompanying her held the IV stand as she guided her down the hallway. Benjamin immediately moved to assist her, but Vivian remained where she was, her eyes fixed on the newcomer with an inscrutable expression. Welcome to your new home, Natalie. Please consider yourself our guest for as long as necessary, said Benjamin, deliberately ignoring the icy look his wife shot in his direction. The following hours were a blur of intense activity. The medical team arrived with the baby, carefully monitored throughout the transport. The equipment was connected with military precision, each sensor checked multiple times to ensure its perfect functioning. Benjamin supervised everything personally, his heart clenching every time he heard the baby's feeble cry during a procedure. He's stronger than he looks, commented the head nurse as she adjusted the last monitor, but he'll need constant attention over the next few weeks. Benjamin found Vivian standing at the door to the baby's room, her gaze lost in the machines keeping the child alive. He came up behind her, enveloping her in a protective embrace as his own tears began to fall. The weight of his son's loss finally hitting him with full force. Forgive me for not being there with you, my love. I know it must be unbearable to see another baby here on this very day, but we cannot let our pain prevent us from helping those in need, he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion. Vivian remained rigid in his arms before gently pulling away. I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. I need space to process all of this, she murmured, leaving him alone with his grief. Night fell silently over the mansion, broken only by the soft beeps of the monitors and the occasional murmur of the nursing staff. Natalie had finally fallen asleep in her room, exhausted by the battle against the fever that had not yet fully subsided. Benjamin allowed himself a moment of respite in his library, his hands trembling as he held the stuffed teddy bear he had bought for Adam. Tears now flowed freely down his face as he hugged the small bear to his chest. My son, my little Adam, how will I go on without you? How can I help that baby when my heart is shattered into 1,000 pieces? You should be here. You could have been friends, grown up together. How could I lose you? Never see you grow? Never see your little face? How could they be so cruel as to take you without giving us a chance to say goodbye? He sobbed, finally allowing himself to feel the full extent of his loss. Meanwhile, downstairs, the mansion's clock had just struck 3 in the morning when a shadow moved silently down the hallway. Vivian, barefoot to avoid making noise, glided like a spectre towards the baby's room. Her movements were calculated, almost feline, as she approached the special crib surrounded by equipment. The dim light of the monitors illuminated her face, revealing an expression that mixed fascination with something deeper, more disturbing. Her hands trembled slightly as she leaned over the crib rail, her eyes fixed on the tiny being sleeping serenely, oblivious to her presence. It was then that her gaze captured something. A small movement of the baby made the boy's shirt rise slightly, revealing a familiar birthmark. Her legs weakened, and she had to lean on the crib railing to avoid falling as tears began to stream down her face. It can't be. Oh God, it can't be. Child, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of emotion and guilt that threatened to consume her. With shaking hands, Vivian began to softly hum the same lullaby she had sung during pregnancy, her tears now freely falling on the small blanket. The blue light of the monitors danced on her face as she leaned in closer, whispering between muffled sobs, My Adam, my son, forgive me. The intimate moment was interrupted by a soft creak coming from the hallway. Someone else was awake at that hour. Benjamin, who couldn't sleep and had gone down to get a glass of water, abruptly stopped upon hearing his wife's choked voice coming from the baby's room. He silently approached the door, his heart freezing as he saw Vivian leaning over the crib, singing a lullaby with so much love and pain that his chest tightened. Her words cut through the night silence like a knife. "My Adam, my son. Forgive me," she whispered between sobs, caressing the baby's little face with an intimacy that left him in shock. The millionaire felt his legs weaken, needing to lean on the door frame to avoid falling. His mind spun, trying to understand what he was witnessing. His wife, who could barely look at the rescued baby hours before, now cradled him as if he were her own lost child. Concern began to grow in his chest as he watched Vivian whispering words of love to a baby that wasn't theirs. My God, has the pain made her go insane? How did I not realize she was so unwell? He thought, feeling guilty for having brought another child home on the day they lost their son. It was then that the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the disturbing moment. A new figure emerged from the shadows. Simon, his brother, was entering through the back door of the mansion, as if it were an old habit. His face took on a grave expression as he saw the scene. Benjamin paralyzed at the door, watching with concern as his wife cradled a strange baby, calling him her son. The man's eyes scanned every detail before his firm voice cut through the silence of dawn. "Vivian, you need to tell him the truth," Simon said, making Benjamin wonder why his own brother was sneaking into his house in the middle of the night. The silence that followed Simon's words was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the baby's monitors. Benjamin, still trying to process the surreal scene before him, took a step forward. The tension in the air was palpable as he looked from his brother to his wife, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Let's all go to the living room," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk and it won't be here near the baby." Vivian clung even tighter to the crib railing, her face a mask of panic and determination. Her hands were shaking, but her posture was firm as she stared at Simon with pleading eyes. "No, don't do this, please, not now," she begged in a desperate whisper. "You don't understand. You can't understand what's at stake." The sound of the argument ended up waking Natalie, who appeared in the hallway still visibly weak, leaning against the wall to remain standing. Her sleepy eyes quickly caught the tension in the air, and something in her instinct made her move towards the baby's room. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep, but her eyes already showing maternal concern. Simon strode into the room with determined steps, making Vivian back away from the crib in panic. Her hands trembled as she positioned herself between him and the child, as if she could protect her secret with her own body. "No, Simon, please. I'll do anything, but don't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. "No one needs to know. We can keep going as we are." Benjamin watched the scene with growing unease, his world beginning to crumble bit by bit. Vivian's behavior, his brother's mysterious presence in the middle of the night, her desperate pleas, everything seemed part of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "What secret is this so terrible you're talking about, Vivian?" he questioned, his voice betraying the anguish he was beginning to feel. Simon did not back down. His eyes, hard as stones, fixed on Vivian as he began to reveal the truth that had been eating away at him for so long. "The baby is our son, Benjamin. Vivian and we had an affair. But she did something unforgivable. She abandoned our son in the rain, left him to die because she didn't have the courage to face the truth." Simon's words fell like bombs in the silence of the room, each one of them shattering what was left of the family. Vivian collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hands covered her face as she finally let her own truth escape. "No, it's not quite like that. The baby. I panicked. When I saw the birthmark just like Simon's, I couldn't bear the thought of everyone finding out, of you finding out about my betrayal, so I... Her voice trailed off into a deep sob, unable to complete the confession of her terrible act. Natalie, who had remained silent until then, advanced with a fury that no one would expect from someone so frail. Her eyes sparkled with indignation as she stared at Vivian. "How could you? How could a mother abandon her own child on a stormy night? You were able to raise him, you could give him everything. How could you do such a thing to a baby? He almost froze to death. I found him alone, dying of cold, rejected by his own mother, who should have protected him," she shouted, her voice laden with a rage that came straight from the heart. "How could you do this to us?" Benjamin finally managed to speak, his voice a whisper laden with pain as he staggered to the nearest armchair. His hands trembled as he tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal, not only of his wife but of his own brother. The world he knew crumbled before his eyes like a house of cards. My own brother. My own wife. Did you plan this? Did you laugh at me all this time? Simon took a step forward, his face a mask of guilt and remorse. The shadows of dawn danced on the walls as he tried to find the right words. It wasn't planned, Benjamin. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake that should never have happened. But when I found out she was pregnant, that he could be my son, his voice faltered, choked with pent-up emotion, I thought she would take care of him, that at least she would do that right. Vivian, still on the floor, raised her tear-stained face. Her eyes wandered between the two brothers, the weight of her choices finally crushing her completely. I didn't know what to do. When I saw the mark, the same as Simon's, I panicked. I thought that if the baby disappeared, no one would ever know, that we could go on with our lives as if nothing had happened, she confessed between sobs, her words echoing like a death sentence for her marriage. Benjamin abruptly rose from the armchair, his hands clenched into fists as he struggled to maintain control. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. You didn't understand. It's not just about the betrayal. You let me believe my son had died. You let me feel that pain, that grief, made everyone at the hospital search for his body. While you knew he was alive somewhere. His voice trembled with a mixture of anger and devastation that made Vivian shrink even further. Benjamin ran his hands over his face, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. The first ray of sunlight began to penetrate through the living room window, illuminating the scene like a cruel spotlight on a family tragedy. His eyes met his brother's, and for the first time in his life he saw in them not his childhood companion, but a stranger who had destroyed everything he loved most. You came here every night, didn't you? That's why you knew the back entrance so well. How many times, Simon? How many times did you enter my house to meet my wife? He asked in a furious tone. Simon instinctively moved closer to Vivian, as if wanting to protect her from the contained fury in his brother's words. His eyes, once guilty, now showed a different determination. It's not what you're thinking, Benjamin. What happened between us? It wasn't just an affair. We fell in love, and now with our child here we can no longer hide, he said, his voice soft as he tried to hold Vivian's trembling hand. Vivian sobbed louder, divided between the comfort offered by Simon and the shame she felt when facing Benjamin. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but when I found out I was pregnant, when I saw the birthmark, I panicked. I didn't know what to do, she confessed, her voice choked by the weight of the tears that wouldn't stop falling. Benjamin walked to the large living room window, his back turned to the couple who had destroyed his life. The sun now fully illuminated the room, bringing a clarity that made it impossible to hide anything. Lies, betrayals, guilt. The pain in his chest was so physical that he could barely breathe. So, all this time, while I was building a life, while I was dreaming of our child, you were already planning this, he asked. Simon took a step forward, still keeping a protective hand on Vivian's back. There was a new confidence in his posture, as if the revelation of the secret had freed something inside him. We didn't plan anything, Benjamin, but now that the truth has come out, I can finally claim my son, give him the name he deserves. I can take care of Vivian as I've always wanted, he declared, his voice firm but gentle as he looked at the woman he loved. Vivian raised her tearful eyes to Benjamin, her voice trembling as she spoke. I know you'll never forgive me for what I did, for the way I abandoned the baby, but I was desperate, confused. Simon was always there for me, even when I didn't deserve it, she confessed, unconsciously moving closer to the man who now openly declared his love. Benjamin turned abruptly, his eyes flashing with an anger he had never felt before. The sound of the baby monitors echoed distantly down the hallway, a constant reminder of the innocent who had almost died because of that triangle of lies. You two are perfect for each other, he said, his voice laden with bitterness. The brother who betrayed his own blood and the mother who abandoned her own child. Get out of my house, now, and never come back. Benjamin took a few steps forward, his voice now more controlled but even more menacing. The morning light cast his shadow on the wall like a giant about to awaken. You have exactly 5 minutes to leave my house before I call the police. And believe me, I have a lot to report. "From trespassing to attempted what you did with the baby," he declared, each word weighted with the promise he would not hesitate to fulfill. Simon wrapped a protective arm around Vivian, but his eyes pleaded with his brother. "The baby, he's my son, Benjamin. You can't keep us from seeing him," he argued, his voice betraying the fear of losing the child he had just found. Vivian sobbed louder by his side, her hands clutching Simon's shirt as if he were her only anchor in a sea of chaos. "Your son?" Benjamin laughed, a humorless sound that echoed through the room like broken glass. His eyes met his brother's with calculated coldness. "The same son you abandoned to die on a stormy night, the son who is only alive thanks to a stranger who risked her own life to save him. No, Simon. You lost any right over him the moment you chose to discard him like trash. You don't deserve that child. You don't deserve his innocence, and he deserves so much more than you can give." The shrill sound of the baby monitor cut through the tense air, causing Vivian to instinctively take a step towards the hallway. Benjamin immediately blocked her path, his stance making it clear he would not allow her to approach the room. "Don't you dare take another step towards that room. You are no longer welcome in this house, Vivian. And as for the baby, he deserves more than a mother who abandons him, and a father who only shows up when it's convenient." Vivian broke down in tears again, her body trembling as she leaned on Simon. The morning light now illuminated her face, devastated by guilt and fear. For a moment everyone stood still. The only sound was the distant beeping of the baby monitors and Vivian's muffled sobs. "Let's go," Simon whispered, gently guiding her towards the door, knowing they had lost that battle. Benjamin watched in silence as his brother and sister-in-law walked towards the exit, their shadows projected on the floor of the mansion that was once his home. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, each echo seeming to take with it a piece of the lies they had built there. When the door finally closed behind them, he allowed his legs to give way, falling heavily into the nearest armchair. Natalie, who had witnessed the entire scene, silently returned to the child's side. The sound of the heart monitors caught Benjamin's attention, reminding him that despite his world crumbling, there was a life that depended on constant care. With heavy steps, he headed towards the makeshift ICU room, focusing his mind on what needed to be done. "The next dose of medication is in an hour," he said mechanically, consulting the spreadsheet left by the medical team. At the appointed time, a nurse entered the baby's room carrying a tray with medications. The noise of the monitors had slightly changed their pattern, indicating that the baby was waking up. With precise movements, she began to check each device, writing down the numbers on her clipboard. "The vital signs are more stable," she informed, her professional voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled after the couple's departure. Benjamin remained close to the door, watching the procedures with attentive eyes, as if each technical detail could help him not think about what had just happened. His phone vibrated constantly in his pocket, probably Simon trying to make contact, but he deliberately ignored it. "How long until we can reduce some of this equipment?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the previous confrontation, concentrating only on what was urgent and necessary. The nurse finished noting the last numbers before turning to him, her face showing cautious optimism. "If he continues to respond well as in the last few hours, we can start reducing respiratory support in 2 or 3 days. But it's a gradual process, Mr. Benjamin. Each baby has their own recovery time, and after the trauma he suffered, we need to be patient," she explained, her voice professional but gentle. The baby began to cry, a louder sound than in previous days, making Natalie instinctively move towards him. Her hands still trembled slightly from her recent fever as she helped the nurse reposition the sensors on the tiny body. Benjamin noticed that the cry, although more vigorous, still carried a worrying wheeze. "The nebulization needs to be done now," said the nurse, already preparing the equipment. "His lungs are still recovering." The morning sun now began to illuminate the room, casting shadows of the medical equipment on the white walls. The medical team moved with efficiency, changing dressings, adjusting monitors, preparing medications. It was like a silent and precise dance, where each movement had a specific purpose. Benjamin watched it all with an almost painful intensity, as if he wanted to etch every detail into his memory. "If there is any change, any minimal alteration in the vital signs, I want to be notified immediately," he ordered, his voice making it clear that this was now his sole priority. Days after the incident that nearly took the baby's life, Benjamin watched the tiny creature lying in the makeshift ICU crib in his mansion, where the wires and medical devices now seemed less invasive. The baby had left the respiratory tubes, and although still under monitoring, already showed an unexpected vitality. Natalie, sitting beside Benjamin, exchanged glances of relief with her friend, grateful for the baby's recovery. "With each passing day, he seems stronger, Benjamin," Natalie commented softly as she adjusted the blanket over the baby. "It's as if he's fighting to show that, despite everything, he's ready to live." Benjamin nodded, admiring the strength that fragile child demonstrated. "Yes, he's a little warrior," he replied, watching the baby with tenderness. "And I don't know how to thank you for being by our side, Natalie." A brief silence followed, a moment of peace where they both shared relief and gratitude for that miracle. In the days that followed, Benjamin had discreetly reported his ex-wife Vivian for the despicable actions that culminated in the abandonment of the child. Natalie had become a constant and reliable presence, offering emotional support and caring for the baby as if it were her own child. The soft sound of the heart monitor filled the room with a steady and soothing rhythm, bringing a sense of security. Natalie watched the baby sleep, her face revealing unconditional love. "I believe he's at peace now. He knows he's safe," she whispered, almost as a consolation to herself. Benjamin, feeling at peace for the first time since it all happened, placed his hand on Natalie's shoulder, smiling gently. "Yes, he is. And I know that somehow my life has changed for the better since you both entered it. I could never imagine that, in so few days, we would find such a strong friendship." Natalie smiled, returning the gesture. "We are grateful for that, Benjamin. Life has a strange way of showing us paths we never thought we would follow, and now we have an entire future ahead of us." The morning lights were beginning to illuminate the room as Benjamin watched Natalie, admiring her strength and resilience. With every moment by her and the baby's side, he felt grateful for the chance to start over and build a life where love and friendship prevailed over the suffering of the past. Months after that turbulent night, Benjamin's mansion had been transformed into a home filled with laughter, love, and a sense of renewed hope. Natalie, now recovered and more confident, walked through the wide corridors, hearing the sound of tiny footsteps and giggles. The baby, whom Benjamin affectionately nicknamed Little Miracle, was stronger than ever. His first steps filled the house with a warmth that Benjamin had not felt for years, since before all the complications that nearly destroyed his life. The morning routine was one of the most anticipated parts for everyone in the house. Natalie used to wake up early to prepare breakfast, always making sure to include the baby's favorite fruits. Little Adam, who was now beginning to babble his first words, was the center of attention in the house. With his curious gaze and ever-ready smile, he won everyone over. Benjamin, who once lived a routine focused solely on business, now dedicated the beginning of the day to moments with the baby and Natalie, sharing meals and light conversations that filled the mornings. "He seems happier every day," Natalie joked once as the little one tried to reach for an apple on the table, imitating Benjamin's gestures. Benjamin smiled, watching the baby affectionately. "He has an adventurous spirit," he said in a playful tone as he helped the little one hold the fruit. Natalie smiled back, no further words needed. She knew that for Benjamin, those moments were precious and that they had both found a new form of family, a new home. The months had strengthened the bonds between them. Natalie cared for the baby with a mother's tenderness, and Benjamin, in turn, supported her in everything, ensuring that she had everything she needed to care for the little one. Over time, Benjamin and Natalie developed such a deep friendship that they both knew life had given them a second chance. Without realizing it, the respect and affection they felt for each other had evolved into an even stronger bond. They were a family, in fact, a team. Benjamin admired her for the sacrifice she had made to save the baby, and Natalie, in turn, found in him the support and security she had never expected to have in her life. As the baby grew, Benjamin found himself making decisions he had never imagined. He, who had never thought of leaving work, began to reduce his commitments, spending more time at home. The moments when he watched the baby's first steps and attempts to speak were more valuable than any meeting. Little by little, he discovered that those moments were the true treasures of his life, something no amount of money could buy. "So it seems you're finding your place in the world, Benjamin," Natalie said one morning, as she watched him play with the baby in the garden. He nodded, pensive. "Yes, I think I've finally found it. Or maybe rediscovered it." The two looked at each other, understanding that their lives had changed irrevocably. Over the months, Benjamin made the decision to formalize the adoption of the baby. He wanted to ensure that the little one had all rights and protection, and Natalie wholeheartedly agreed. She knew that this decision would only solidify the foundation of the new family they were building together. The adoption process was marked by bureaucracies, but Benjamin, who had always been determined, did not hesitate to face each step, ensuring that the baby was officially part of his life and legacy. He adopted the boy, as did Natalie, now as Adam's mother. "You're an amazing father," Natalie said once, watching him sign the documents that would finalize the adoption. He looked at her with gratitude, his expression softening as he held her hand. "All of this was only possible because you came into my life, Natalie. You and our little miracle gave me a reason to start over." Those months together strengthened Benjamin and Natalie as a true family. Their days were simple but full of meaning. Walks in the park, visits to the zoo, afternoons of play on the mansion lawn. The household staff also noticed the change in the atmosphere. The seriousness that had once permeated the home was replaced by a lighter, more welcoming atmosphere, and everyone in the mansion seemed happier. On a certain late afternoon, Benjamin and Natalie sat on the porch, watching the baby run across the lawn, laughing and exploring every corner of the garden. The sunset tinged the sky with shades of orange and pink, illuminating the trees and the smiles on their faces. Benjamin, holding a cup of hot tea, looked at Natalie with a serene smile. "I never thought I would find such peace," he confessed, his eyes shining. "Every day with you makes me see that despite everything, it is still possible to build something beautiful and true." Natalie smiled, taking his hand gently. "You deserve this, Benjamin. Life brought us here because we were ready to start over, and now we're giving this little one a childhood filled with love, security, and affection, something he will always remember." The baby, tired of playing, ran up to them and with open arms asked to be held. Benjamin picked him up, caressing his face tenderly. He felt a happiness he had not experienced in years. He and Natalie had found a way to be happy together, even though life had led them to it in such an unexpected way. As the baby slept peacefully in Benjamin's lap, Natalie rested her head on his shoulder, sighing softly. At that moment, neither of them felt the need to speak. Each other's presence and the sound of the baby's peaceful breathing were enough. They had finally found true and lasting peace. And so in that mansion, once marked by disillusionment and loneliness, a new life blossomed, full of love, hope, and a long-lost tranquility. The walls, once so silent and cold, now echoed with laughter, evening conversations, and the sound of the baby's little steps as he explored every corner with curiosity. Natalie and Benjamin had become more than friends. They were partners who deeply trusted each other, sharing moments of complicity and mutual support. They had faced the past and overcome challenges together, discovering day by day the joy of living without reservations. And the baby, with his sincere smile and innocent sparkle in his eyes, was the bond that united those two once so hurt and distrustful hearts, as if he were the silent answer to their prayers for a second chance. As the starry sky spread above them, bringing a calm and clear night, they both allowed themselves to feel the weight of all they had built. The mansion was no longer just a physical refuge, but a true home, where love and peace now prevailed over any bitter memory. And there, with the baby nestled between them and under that illuminated sky, they knew without a shadow of a doubt that they were finally a family, one that time and difficulties would only strengthen. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next stunning narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now, you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.